3 years, 2 months, and counting. That is how long Russia's rear area logistics network has operated with near total impunity. A sprawling web of fuel depots, ammunition stores, railway hubs, and industrial supply chains sitting hundreds of kilometers behind the front line, feeding the grinding war machine that Vladimir Putin has staked his presidency on. Last week, Ukraine hit it, not with a single drone, not with a lucky strike, with a coordinated deep penetration campaign that took out one of the most consequential nodes in Russia's entire eastern supply architecture. The numbers are not small, and the implications are not either. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because this channel is where you come when you want to understand not just what happened on the battlefield, but why it happened, what it means, and where it is taking this war. Today's analysis is one you do not want to miss. Here is what I am going to show you. First, I will walk you through exactly what Ukraine hit, where it is, and why that specific target matters far more than the headlines suggest. Then I am going to explain the weapons Ukraine used to reach it, because the how is just as important as the what. After that, we will get into the strategic implications, what losing this node does to Russia's operational tempo along the eastern axis, and why Russian military planners are going to spend the next several weeks dealing with a logistics crisis they did not anticipate. And finally, I will show you the second-order effects, the ripple damage that spreads outward from a single precision strike on the right target. By the time we are done, you will understand why this is not just another headline. This is a structural blow to the Russian way of war. Let's start with context, because without it, this strike looks like a tactical success and nothing more. That would be a serious underreading of what just happened. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has always been, at its core, a logistics war. The Russian military doctrine that drove the initial invasion in February 2022, blitzkrieg toward Kyiv, rapid decapitation, administrative collapse, failed inside 72 hours. What replaced it was something far older and, in some ways, far more dangerous, a war of attrition powered by mass. Russia has conscripted, contracted, and coerced hundreds of thousands of soldiers into service since the initial invasion stalled. It has drawn on Soviet-era ammunition stockpiles, Iranian-supplied drones, and North Korean artillery shells to sustain artillery expenditure rates that dwarf anything NATO militaries have fired since the Korean War. At peak intensity in 2023 and 2024, Russian forces were expending somewhere between 20 and 30,000 artillery rounds per day along active front sectors, according to assessments from the Royal United Services Institute in London. That level of consumption does not sustain itself. It requires an industrial supply chain of extraordinary complexity, and that chain has a geography. It runs from arms factories in the Ural region and the Volga Basin, westward through railway junctions and highway corridors, into forward distribution points scattered across Belgorod, Kursk, Rostov, and the occupied territories of eastern Ukraine. Every tank shell, every mortar round, every fuel drum for armored vehicles has to travel that chain. Disrupt a critical node in it, and you do not just slow the front line, you starve it. Ukraine has understood this since the early months of the war. The challenge has always been reach. Ukrainian forces have spent 3 years trying to push their strike capabilities deeper into Russian territory, first with domestically produced drones of varying range and reliability, then with Western-supplied missiles, most notably the Anglo-French Storm Shadow and its variant Scalp EG, and American-supplied ATAC-EMS ballistic missiles, which the Biden administration authorized for limited cross-border use in late 2024. Each of those systems expanded Ukraine's effective strike range. Each came with political constraints that limited what could be targeted and when. The target hit last week sits well inside what had previously been considered a relatively safe rear area. It is a railway logistics hub and associated fuel storage complex, the kind of facility that Russian military planners rely on to stage supplies before forward distribution. Rail is the backbone of Russian military logistics at operational depth. Russia's rail network is one of the densest in the world for military purposes, and the gauge difference between Russian and European rail, a legacy of 19th-century engineering decisions, means supplies cannot simply be transferred from Western rail systems without transshipment. These hubs are therefore not optional architecture, they are mandatory. Destroying one does not merely inconvenience Russian planners. It forces rerouting, creates bottlenecks, and imposes time delays at precisely the points where Russian operational tempo depends on continuity. Ukraine's ability to strike this kind of target represents a genuine evolution in the war, not because deep strikes are new, but because the precision, coordination, and depth of penetration involved signal something qualitatively different from what we have seen before. Now let's talk about what Ukraine actually used, because the weapon system here matters enormously. The strike was executed using a combination of long-range Ukrainian-developed drones, most likely variants of the Palyantsia or Lyuty series, Ukraine's domestically produced jet-powered strike drones, combined with what Ukrainian and Western defense analysts are describing as a coordinated electronic warfare suppression package designed to degrade Russian air defense response times. This is important. Striking a target at extended range is one thing. Striking it while actively suppressing the radar and communication systems meant to intercept you is something else entirely. Ukraine's drone development program has accelerated at a pace that has genuinely surprised Western defense analysts. At the start of the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian drone capability was primarily limited to commercial quadcopters modified for observation and small munitions delivery. By late 2023, Ukraine had begun fielding first-generation long-range strike drones with operational ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers. By the summer of 2024, Ukrainian engineers had produced variants capable of precision terminal guidance using a combination of GPS, visual terrain matching, and inertial navigation, which means they remain accurate even when GPS signals are jammed, a capability Russia invested heavily in degrading. The Lyuty, whose name translates roughly as fierce or furious in Ukrainian, is a jet-powered drone with a reported range of approximately 1,000 to 1,200 kilometers and a warhead sufficient to cause serious structural damage to hardened storage facilities. It is not the most sophisticated weapon Ukraine has received or developed. What makes it operationally significant is that it is produced domestically at scale, which means it is not subject to the political constraints that limit Ukraine's use of Western-supplied systems. Ukraine does not need to ask permission to use a Lyuty against a target inside Russia. That distinction is not a minor footnote. It is one of the most important strategic shifts of the past 12 months. Think about what that means for a moment. For the first 18 months of the full-scale war, Ukraine's ability to strike Russian territory was almost entirely dependent on Western political will, which was cautious, inconsistent, and subject to escalation concerns that often prioritized Moscow's comfort level over Kyiv's military needs. Each time Ukraine wanted to use an ATACMS or a Storm Shadow against a target inside Russian-controlled territory, there was a political negotiation, a set of restrictions, a list of prohibited target categories. Ukraine was fighting a near-peer adversary with one hand tied behind its back, and the rope was held in Washington and London. The expansion of Ukraine's domestic strike capability changes that equation fundamentally. It gives Ukrainian military planners independent operational reach, the ability to design and execute deep strike campaigns without requiring approval from allied capitals. That independence is what makes last week's strike something more than a tactical event. Now let's get into the tactical significance of this specific target and what it does to Russian operations in the near term. The logistics hub that Ukraine struck serves as a key distribution point for Russian forces operating along what military analysts describe as the Eastern Axis, the broad operational corridor stretching through Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, where Russia has concentrated its heaviest offensive pressure over the past year. This is the axis where Russia has been grinding forward, slowly, expensively, at enormous human cost, toward Kramatorsk, Kostiantynivka, and the broader Donetsk city agglomeration that remains one of Ukraine's critical urban anchors in the east. Sustaining offensive pressure along that axis requires continuous supply. Offensive operations are more logistically demanding than defensive ones. Attacking forces consume ammunition faster, suffer vehicle attrition more rapidly, require more fuel for sustained movement, and need more frequent medical and personnel replenishment than forces holding static positions. Russia has been able to sustain this pressure because its rear area supply chain was functioning, not efficiently, not without waste, but functioning adequately to keep sufficient ammunition and fuel flowing forward. Disrupting a hub of this type imposes what military planners call a throughput penalty. The supplies do not disappear. Most of what was stored in that facility will be rerouted through alternative nodes. But rerouting takes time, and time in an active offensive is not neutral. Russian forces along the Eastern Axis typically operate on resupply cycles calibrated to their existing logistics architecture. A disruption that extends those cycles by even 48 to 72 hours creates operational gaps, windows where forward units are rationing ammunition, where artillery cannot sustain its normal rate of fire, where armored spearheads cannot advance because they lack fuel security for a potential withdrawal if the attack stalls. Those gaps are exactly what Ukrainian defensive commanders are trained to exploit. You do not need to destroy a supply network to degrade an offensive. You need to create enough friction that the attacking force loses momentum at the critical moments. That is what this strike is designed to achieve. Not a knockout blow, but a carefully timed disruption inserted at a point in the Russian operational cycle where it causes maximum cascading effect. According to assessments from the Institute for the Study of War, which tracks Russian operational patterns in granular detail, Russian forces along the Donetsk axis have been attempting to sustain offensive tempo through a series of coordinated company and battalion-level assaults designed to identify and exploit weak points in Ukrainian defensive lines. That kind of continuous probing requires continuous ammunition consumption. Interrupt the supply chain feeding it, and you give Ukrainian defenders breathing room, time to rotate units, repair equipment, reinforce vulnerable sectors, and prepare counterattack options that would be foreclosed if Russian pressure were unrelenting. But here is where the analysis needs to go deeper, because the tactical effects are only part of the story. The strategic significance of this strike is less about the specific hub Ukraine destroyed and more about what it demonstrates regarding Ukrainian strike doctrine. For the first time in this conflict, Ukrainian forces have shown the ability to combine long-range domestic strike assets, electronic warfare suppression, and operational intelligence in a coordinated package targeting rear-area logistics infrastructure at scale. That is not a coincidence of opportunity. That is a planned, rehearsed, and executed deep strike campaign, the kind of operation that requires weeks of preparation, intelligence collection, route analysis, and timing coordination. What it tells us is that Ukraine has developed something that military doctrine calls a suppression of enemy air defense, or CAD, capability at operational depth combined with precision strike against fixed infrastructure. This combination is what serious air forces have spent decades developing. Ukraine has been building it from scratch, under fire, with a fraction of the resources available to NATO militaries, and last week they used it. The Russian military's response to this is instructive. Russian state media initially tried to downplay the strike, describing it as minor damage quickly contained. Within 48 hours, that narrative had shifted. Russian military bloggers, the so-called mill bloggers, who often provide more candid assessments than official sources, were acknowledging significant damage and expressing frustration with air defense failures that allowed the strike to reach its target. This is a pattern we have seen before. When Russian official narratives collapse quickly, it is usually because the damage on the ground is visible enough to make denial untenable. The air defense failure dimension of this story deserves particular attention. Russia has invested massively in layered air defense architecture. The S-300 and S-400 systems that have made Ukrainian fixed-wing aviation largely irrelevant over the front lines, combined with shorter-range systems like the Buk M3 and Pantsir S-1 designed to engage lower-altitude threats. This architecture is not evenly distributed. It is concentrated along the front lines and around high-value fixed targets like command centers and major airfields. Rear-area logistics hubs have received less coverage, partly because of resource constraints, partly because the assumption was that Ukrainian strike range could not threaten them consistently. That assumption has now been disproven at cost. Russia will adjust. It will redistribute air defense assets to cover rear logistics nodes more comprehensively, but redistribution is not free. Every S-400 battery move to protect a railway junction in Belgorod is one that is no longer providing coverage along the front lines. Ukraine does not need to destroy Russia's air defense network. It needs to force Russia to thin it out, to make difficult choices about coverage priorities, to create gaps that other strike options can then exploit. This is air defense suppression through strategic pressure, and it is working. Now let's talk about the second-order effects, because this is where the implications of this strike extend well beyond the immediate battlefield. The first second-order effect is psychological, and it should not be underestimated. Russia's rear areas have functioned as a sanctuary for most of this war. Russian soldiers rotated off the front line for rest and reconstitution have moved into rear areas expecting safety. Russian logistics personnel, railway workers, and support troops have operated under the assumption that their distance from the front line provided meaningful protection. That assumption is now compromised. When rear areas are no longer safe, you create a problem that no amount of additional air defense can fully solve. because the human dimension of military effectiveness depends in part on soldiers believing that there are places where they can recover, repair, and prepare without constant threat. The second-order effect involves Russian defense industrial planning. Russia has been reconfiguring its defense industrial base for sustained war production at a remarkable pace over the past 2 years. Factories in the Ural region have shifted to multi-shift operations. Artillery shell production has reportedly expanded significantly, though exact figures are disputed. The Russian government has structured its budget to prioritize defense spending at levels not seen since the Soviet era. But all of that production has to move forward, and the forward movement depends on logistics infrastructure that Ukraine is now demonstrating it can reach and damage. Every strike on a logistics node forces Russia to invest in protective infrastructure, hardening facilities, dispersing stocks, establishing redundant rail routes, which diverts resources from production and from the front line. The third second-order effect is geopolitical, and this is perhaps the most significant of all. Ukraine's development of an independent deep strike capability changes the calculus for Western allies in ways that are still playing out. One of the persistent arguments for limiting Western weapons transfers and political authorization for their use has been escalation risk, the fear that enabling Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia would provoke a Russian response targeting NATO infrastructure or escalating to nuclear threats. Ukraine's use of domestically produced systems to strike targets inside Russia sidesteps that debate entirely. When Ukraine uses a Lyuti against a logistics hub in Belgorod, NATO members bear no direct responsibility. Russia cannot credibly threaten retaliation against NATO for weapons that NATO did not supply. This creates space, political space that Ukraine can use to push further, to strike deeper, to expand the geographic scope of its pressure campaign without requiring Allied authorization. According to reporting from Politico's defense correspondents and from analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Western defense officials have privately expressed relief that Ukraine's domestic strike capability has advanced to this level precisely because it removes a source of ongoing political tension within the alliance. The debate about whether to authorize ATACMS for deep strikes was always uncomfortable. It forced NATO governments to make explicit choices about escalation risk that they would rather not make publicly. Ukraine's domestic capability provides a way around that awkward conversation. Now, intellectual honesty requires acknowledging what this strike does not accomplish, and where the analysis has genuine limitations. Let's be clear about what this is not. This is not a decisive blow to Russian logistics. Russia's supply chain is vast, distributed, and largely redundant. The specific hub Ukraine struck will be repaired, rerouted around, or replaced over a period of weeks to months. Russian military planners are not naive. They have been aware of logistics vulnerability since the early failures of 2022 and have spent 2 years hardening and dispersing their supply architecture. The strike creates friction. It does not create paralysis. There is also a measurement problem here that honest analysts have to acknowledge. It is genuinely difficult to assess from open sources exactly how much damage was done, how long recovery will take, and what the operational effects on frontline ammunition supply will be. Ukrainian claims about strike effectiveness are often optimistic. Russian official statements are often designed to minimize. The most reliable assessments come from independent monitoring of Russian millblogger reactions, satellite imagery from services like Planet Labs and Maxar Technologies, and shipping and railway tracking data, and even those sources have gaps and limitations. There is also an alternative interpretation worth considering. Some analysts, including several writing for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, argue that escalating Ukrainian deep strikes into Russian territory, even with domestically produced weapons, carries escalation risks that are difficult to model. The logic is straightforward. If Ukraine demonstrates the ability to strike critical infrastructure deep inside Russian territory at scale, Russian military planners face pressure to respond in kind, either by expanding attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, which has already been severe, or by seeking to accelerate offensive operations before Ukraine's strike capability matures further. The escalation ladder is not one-directional, and the rungs above current levels remain dangerous. This is a legitimate analytical concern. It does not change the assessment that Ukraine's strike capability represents genuine strategic progress. But it does mean that the path forward is not simply linear. More strikes, more pressure, inevitable Russian collapse. The war remains deeply uncertain. Russian resilience continues to surprise analysts, and the human cost on both sides is accumulating at a rate that should give anyone pause. So where does this leave us? What does this strike tell us about the trajectory of this war, and what should you be watching for in the weeks ahead? Here is the synthesis. Ukraine just demonstrated something that Russia spent 3 years assuming would not happen: the development of a mature, independent, deep penetration strike capability targeting rear-area logistics at operational depth. That capability did not exist at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. It exists now, built under fire through technical ingenuity, domestic production, and hard operational learning. That is not a minor development. That is a strategic inflection point. The implications run in several directions simultaneously. In the near term, Ukrainian military planners now have a meaningful new tool for managing Russian offensive pressure along the eastern axis, not by defeating Russian forces in direct engagement, but by degrading the supply chain that feeds their attacks. In the medium term, Russia faces a strategic choice: divert resources to harden and disperse its logistics infrastructure, accepting reduced offensive capability and production efficiency, or accept continued vulnerability and absorb the operational costs. Neither option is attractive. In the long term, Ukraine's demonstration of domestic strike capability changes the negotiating dynamic. It signals to Russian planners that the sanctuary of rear area depth is no longer reliable, which affects how they calculate the costs and benefits of continued offensive pressure. Watch 3 things in the coming weeks. First, watch Russian air defense redistribution. If satellites and monitoring sources show S-300 or S-400 batteries relocating from frontline sectors to rear logistics areas, it confirms that Russia is responding to the threat Ukraine just demonstrated. Second, watch Ukrainian strike tempo. If last week's strike was a one-time demonstration, its strategic effect will be limited. If it is the opening of a sustained deep strike campaign targeting multiple logistics nodes in sequence, the cumulative pressure begins to compound. Third, watch the political response in Western capitals, specifically whether Ukraine's domestic strike capability creates new openings for Allied support that had been constrained by escalation concerns. The war is not over. The grinding attrition continues. But Ukraine just changed one of the fundamental assumptions that had governed the conflict for 3 years, and that matters more than any single headline can capture. That is the analysis for today. If this gave you genuine insight into what is actually happening in this conflict and why it matters, subscribe to States News and share this with someone who wants to understand the war beyond the surface. The next video is already in production, and if the developments of the past week are any indication, the story is moving fast. You will want to be here for what comes next.